What would you do if the neighbor you thought you knew turned out to be hiding a deadly secret? When Claire Madison began noticing strange activities at the house next door, she thought it was just her imagination. But by the time she discovered the horrifying truth, it was almost too late. And the most chilling part? The people she trusted the most were involved all along. Stay with us as we unravel the shocking story of a suburban nightmare that no one saw coming. The morning sun bathed the picturesque neighborhood in a soft golden glow. It was the kind of place where manicured lawns stretched endlessly, and the hum of sprinklers filled the silence. Most of the residents took pride in their homes and routines, cherishing the illusion of perfection that surrounded their lives. Claire Madison was no different. A middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a habit of knowing everyone's business, Claire believed she was the unofficial guardian of the community. Her mornings usually began with a cup of tea in one hand and a pair of binoculars in the other, keeping watch from her porch. Nothing escaped her notice. Not the delivery vans, not the new families moving in, and certainly not the Browns. The Browns had moved into the corner house about 6 months ago. It was one of the largest properties in the neighborhood, with an immaculate garden and sleek modern design that stood out among the more traditional homes. From the moment they arrived, Claire had felt a sense of unease. She had smiled politely when they introduced themselves, but behind her friendly mask she questioned how they could afford such a place. David Brown was charismatic and sharp, a man who exuded quiet confidence. His wife, Maria, was equally impressive, carrying herself with grace and dignity. Their teenage daughter, Nia, was friendly but kept to herself, spending most of her time reading in their sprawling backyard. At first, Claire tried to brush off her feelings. Perhaps she was just overthinking, as she often did. But then came the small things, those late-night visitors who arrived in expensive cars and left without staying long. The delivery trucks that seemed to come and go far more often than any other house in the neighborhood. It wasn't long before Claire's suspicions turned into obsession. She told herself it wasn't prejudice, it was concern. After all, she had lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years. She had seen families come and go, but none had ever made her feel this unsettled. That morning, as Claire sipped her tea and watched the Browns' house, a black sedan pulled into their driveway. A tall man in a crisp suit stepped out, glanced around as though checking for prying eyes, and hurried to the door. Claire leaned forward, her heart racing. Who was he? Why was he in such a rush? Moments later, the door opened, and Maria welcomed him inside with a warm smile. Claire frowned, her grip tightening on the mug. This was no casual visitor. Something was definitely off. Her train of thought was interrupted by the sudden wail of sirens. Startled, Claire turned her gaze toward the sound. 2 police cars sped past her house, their lights flashing, heading toward the park at the edge of the neighborhood. Claire's unease deepened. The park was usually quiet, a place where joggers and dog walkers mingled peacefully. Sirens weren't part of the norm. As the police cars disappeared into the distance, Claire felt a pang of dread in her chest. Something terrible had happened, and she had a sinking feeling it was only the beginning. She debated for a moment before grabbing her phone and stepping outside. As she made her way toward the park, she noticed other neighbors gathering along the sidewalk, whispering in hushed tones. The air was heavy with curiosity and fear. When Claire arrived at the park, the scene before her took her breath away. Yellow police tape cordoned off a section near the old oak tree, and officers were pacing back and forth, their faces grim. A black tarp covered something or someone on the ground. A gasp escaped from someone in the crowd. "That's Daniel Reed," a woman whispered, clutching her husband's arm. Claire's head snapped toward the voice. Daniel Reed was a well-known name in the area. He was a wealthy developer who had been involved in several controversial property deals over the years. He was also known for being ruthless in his business dealings, a man who didn't shy away from stepping on others to climb higher. What was he doing here, lying lifeless in their quiet neighborhood park? Claire's mind raced with questions. The sight of the body, coupled with the strange activity at the Browns' house, created a whirlwind of suspicion in her head. She turned on her heel and walked briskly back to her house, her pulse quickening with every step. She couldn't shake the feeling that the Browns knew something, or worse, had something to do with this. By the time she reached her porch, her hands were trembling. She had to act. If the police wouldn't dig deeper into the Browns, then she would. This wasn't just about Daniel Reed. This was about the Browns. They didn't belong here, Claire thought, not with their secrets and their unexplained wealth. She was sure of it now. Something about them wasn't right, and she was going to find out exactly what it was. Little did she know, her obsession would soon lead her down a path far darker than she could have imagined. Back at her house, Claire paced the living room, her mind spinning with theories. The image of the black sedan and the man in the suit replayed in her head like a film reel. It didn't help that the sight of Daniel Reed's body at the park had rattled her. She couldn't stop connecting the two events. What if the Browns had something to do with his death? Daniel wasn't just any developer. He was ruthless and powerful, the kind of man who made enemies easily. But the Browns were new here. What could possibly tie them to him? Claire sat at her kitchen table, opened her laptop, and typed "David Brown Real Estate" into the search bar. Articles popped up about his business ventures, successful deals, awards for community service, and even a glowing feature in a local magazine about his commitment to urban development. The articles painted a picture of a man who was not only wealthy, but also well-respected. But Claire wasn't convinced. She clicked through the photos of David smiling at ribbon-cutting ceremonies and shaking hands with politicians. It all seemed too perfect, too polished. Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her friend and fellow busybody, Margaret. "Did you see the cops at the park? Something big is going on." Claire quickly typed back, "It's Daniel Reed. He's dead, found in the park this morning." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "I think the Browns know something about it." Margaret's response came almost immediately. "What? Why would you think that?" Claire frowned, biting her lip. She didn't want to sound paranoid, but the words spilled out of her anyway. There's something off about them. Late-night visitors. Strange deliveries. And this morning, a man in a suit came to their house right before the cops showed up at the park. For a few minutes, Margaret didn't reply. Claire stared at the screen, feeling a flicker of doubt. Maybe she was overreacting. But before she could convince herself, Margaret's reply came. "Maybe you're on to something. Keep an eye on them." That was all the encouragement Claire needed. She felt a surge of validation. She wasn't crazy. Others could see it too. She decided she'd start documenting everything. Her first step was to figure out who the man in the suit was. He didn't seem like a friend. He had looked too cautious, too purposeful. And why would someone like David Brown need such secretive meetings if everything was above board? Claire grabbed her binoculars from the windowsill and sat by the front window. She had the perfect view of the Browns' driveway and front door. Hours passed with no activity, but she didn't mind. Watching and waiting gave her a sense of control. She jotted down notes in a small notebook, detailing every visitor, every car, every package. Around midday, she noticed a delivery van pull up to the Browns' house. The driver unloaded several large boxes marked with the logo of a high-end electronics company. Claire's eyebrows knit together as she scribbled furiously. What could they possibly need all that for? Moments later, David himself stepped out, shook the driver's hand, and carried the boxes inside. Claire noted how calm he looked, as though he hadn't a care in the world. It irritated her. If they had something to hide, they were doing a good job of it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire's mind returned to Daniel Reed. She thought about the rumors that had swirled around him in the past. People said he had ruined lives, stolen land, and made enemies in the process. Could David Brown have been one of those enemies? Could this entire neighborhood have been part of some larger scheme involving Reed and the Browns? Claire didn't have answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to sit back and let this go unnoticed. If the Browns were connected to Reed's death, she would find out, and she'd make sure everyone else did too. What she didn't realize was that her curiosity was already leading her into dangerous territory. The more she pried into the Browns' lives, the closer she got to uncovering secrets far darker than she had anticipated. But Claire was too determined to see the warning signs, and her obsession was about to take a deadly turn. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation about Daniel Reed's death. Whispers spread like wildfire. At the local cafe, at the park, even in the grocery store checkout lines, everyone had an opinion. Some thought it was a robbery gone wrong. Others hinted at revenge for one of Daniel's many shady deals. But Claire's mind stayed firmly fixed on the Browns. Every interaction she observed, every car that passed by their house, added fuel to her suspicions. By mid-morning, police cars were once again parked near the Browns' corner house. Claire stood at her window, her heart pounding as she watched two officers approach the front door. Maria answered, dressed in her usual professional attire, her expression calm but slightly guarded. Claire couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw the officers hand over a piece of paper. A warrant, perhaps, before stepping inside. The sight sent a thrill through her. Finally, she thought, there looking into them, she grabbed her phone and texted Margaret. "Police are at the Browns' house. Told you they were involved." Margaret's reply came quickly. "They're probably just questioning everyone. Doesn't mean anything." Claire scoffed and put down her phone. She knew it meant something. The Browns weren't like the rest of them. They didn't belong here, not with their money, their secrets, and their suspicious connections. She grabbed her binoculars and settled by the window, straining to see what was happening inside. The blinds were partially drawn, but she caught glimpses of the officers talking to David, who gestured toward the dining table. Papers were spread out in front of him, and he seemed to be explaining something. After about an hour, the officers emerged, their faces unreadable. Maria walked them to the door, maintaining her composure as they left. Claire watched closely, expecting a reaction, anger, worry, something, but Maria simply turned, went back inside, and shut the door. Claire frowned. That wasn't the behavior of someone under pressure. It was too calm, too measured. What were they hiding? Later that afternoon, Claire decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, her ears tuned to any scraps of conversation about the Browns or Daniel Reed. At the park, she overheard two women discussing the case. "I heard the police found something in his car," one said in a hushed tone. "Documents, maybe?" "What kind of documents?" the other asked, leaning in. Don't know, the first replied, shrugging, but someone said it has to do with property deals. Maybe someone he cheated finally snapped. Claire froze, her mind racing. Property deals? That could mean anything, or it could mean the Browns. David was in real estate after all. What if Daniel had double-crossed him? What if the Browns weren't just suspects, they were directly involved? As she walked back home, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to the truth. Her thoughts were interrupted when she spotted something unusual. A black car parked across the street from the Browns' house. It wasn't the same sedan she had seen before, but it looked just as expensive. The driver, a man in dark sunglasses, sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the house. Claire's curiosity flared. Who was this man? A private investigator? An accomplice? She slowed her pace, pretending to tie her shoe as she tried to get a better look. The man didn't move, but she could feel his presence like a weight in the air. Something about him unsettled her. She hurried home, her mind spinning with questions. That evening, Claire sat in her living room flipping through the notes she had taken over the past few days. The late-night visitors, the deliveries, the police visit, the mysterious man in the black car. It all added up to something. But what? She glanced out the window toward the Browns' house. The lights were on, and she could see silhouettes moving inside. They seemed normal, even happy, but Claire didn't trust it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She jumped, her heart racing. Who would visit her at this hour? Peering through the peephole, she saw Margaret standing on the porch, looking nervous. Claire opened the door and ushered her inside. They're saying the police found something else, Margaret whispered as soon as the door was shut. In Daniel Reed's house. Bank statements, business records, and David Brown's name was all over them. Claire felt a shiver run down her spine. She had been right all along. The Browns weren't innocent. They were involved, deeply involved. But if David's name was connected to Daniel's shady business, what else could the Browns be hiding? Claire's paranoia deepened, and with it, her determination to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Claire couldn't sleep that night. Every sound outside her window made her tense. Every creak of the house felt like an omen. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind consumed by the new revelation Margaret had brought her. David Brown's name on Daniel Reed's business records wasn't just suspicious. It was damning. Her gut told her there was more to this story, and if the police weren't piecing it together fast enough, she would. By dawn, she was already dressed and sipping her tea, staring out the window. The black car from the previous day was gone, but now Claire felt as though the entire neighborhood was under some invisible cloud. Even the familiar sights, mail carriers, joggers, children walking to school, seemed eerie, as though everyone was part of a conspiracy she hadn't yet unraveled. Unable to sit still, she grabbed her coat and headed out for a walk, weaving through the quiet streets, her eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary. When she reached the Browns' house, she slowed her pace. The blinds were drawn tight, and there was no sign of movement. Still, Claire felt as though she was being watched. She turned abruptly, her heart pounding, but there was no one there. "Losing your mind, Claire," she muttered to herself, shaking her head, but she couldn't deny the nagging feeling that something or someone was watching her every move. As she rounded the corner toward the park, she noticed two men standing by the police tape that still cordoned off the area where Daniel Reed's body had been found. They weren't wearing uniforms, but their suits and serious expressions suggested they were detectives. One of them held a clipboard, and the other gestured toward the tree line. Claire slowed her steps, pretending to check her phone as she strained to catch snippets of their conversation. "Looks like it was placed deliberately," one said. "Could be a warning," the other replied, "or a message." Claire's brow furrowed. A warning? A message? What could they be talking about? Her curiosity burned, but before she could linger any longer, one of the detectives glanced in her direction. She quickly turned and walked away, her pulse racing. When she got home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of discovering something big. The mention of a deliberate placement, whatever that meant, added another layer of intrigue. Was it connected to the Browns, to the black car, or was it something else entirely? Determined to dig deeper, Claire decided to take matters into her own hands. She pulled out her laptop and searched for any public records on David Brown's business dealings. It took some digging, but eventually she found an old lawsuit filed by a former business partner, someone who claimed David had cheated them out of a lucrative deal. The case had been dismissed, but the details were enough to plant seeds of doubt in Claire's mind. What if David had used the same tactics on Daniel Reed? What if their entire wealth was built on lies? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Startled, Claire hesitated before walking cautiously to the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw a young woman with dark hair and a nervous expression standing on her porch. Claire opened the door just enough to speak. "Can I help you?" she asked. The woman glanced over her shoulder before leaning closer. "You don't know me, but I need to talk to someone about the Browns." Claire's heart skipped a beat. She stepped aside, letting the woman in and shutting the door quickly behind her. The woman introduced herself as Jenna, a former employee of Daniel Reed's real estate firm. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and Claire could see the fear in her eyes. "Daniel was involved in some bad deals," Jenna began, wringing her hands. "And so was David Brown. I overheard things, conversations about money, properties being sold under the table. But it's not just that. There was a fight between them a few weeks ago. I didn't hear all of it, but Daniel was threatening to expose David. He said something about papers, proof of what he'd done." Claire leaned forward, her breath caught in her throat. "Did he ever go public with it?" Jenna shook her head. "No. He said he was going to, but now he's dead. And I'm scared. I think David knows I know something." The weight of Jenna's words sank in, and for the first time Claire felt a flicker of fear. If David Brown was capable of silencing Daniel Reed, what would stop him from coming after Jenna, or anyone else who got in his way? Claire's paranoia deepened. She thanked Jenna for her courage, but warned her to be careful. After Jenna left, Claire locked her doors and windows, her heart pounding. For the first time, she wondered if her obsession with the Browns had put her in danger. But even as fear crept in, so did resolve. She wasn't going to stop now. She couldn't. Somewhere in the tangled web of secrets, lies, and death, the truth was waiting to be uncovered, and Claire was determined to find it, before it found her. The day after Jenna's visit, Claire couldn't shake the gnawing anxiety that had taken root in her chest. Jenna's story replayed in her mind like a broken record, each detail more troubling than the last. The connection between Daniel Reed and David Brown felt undeniable now, but the stakes had shifted. This wasn't just about uncovering secrets. There was danger lurking, and Claire felt it creeping closer with every passing hour. That afternoon, Claire decided to visit Margaret. She needed someone to talk to, someone who might understand the weight of what she had learned. Margaret lived just a few houses down, and Claire hurried over, glancing over her shoulder every few steps. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, even though the street was eerily quiet. Margaret answered the door with a smile that faded quickly when she saw Claire's face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, stepping aside to let her in. Claire wasted no time. She sat down at Margaret's kitchen table and spilled everything: Jenna's visit, the police presence, the black car, and the cryptic things she'd overheard at the park. Margaret listened quietly, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "You're playing with fire, Claire," Margaret said when she finished. "If David Brown really is involved in something dangerous, you could be putting yourself in harm's way." "I can't stop now," Claire replied, her voice firm despite the unease bubbling inside her. "There's too much at stake. Jenna is terrified. The Browns are hiding something, and I'm going to find out what." Margaret sighed, shaking her head. "Just be careful. And maybe it's time to involve the police." Claire considered this for a moment, but quickly dismissed the idea. The police were already circling the Browns, but they didn't have enough to act. If she brought them half-baked suspicions, she'd risk tipping off David Brown, and she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. As Claire left Margaret's house and walked back to her own, she noticed something strange. A package was sitting on her doorstep, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Her stomach dropped as she approached it, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't ordered anything recently, and the lack of any markings sent a chill down her spine. She picked it up cautiously and brought it inside, locking the door behind her. Setting the package on the kitchen table, she stared at it for a long moment before grabbing a pair of scissors. Her heart pounded as she cut through the tape and peeled back the paper. Inside was a manila envelope with her name scrawled on the front in black ink. With trembling fingers, Claire opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photographs. Her breath caught in her throat. The first image was of her, sitting on her porch with her binoculars. The next showed her walking toward the park. Another captured her standing near the police tape, her face partially turned toward the detectives. There were more. Photos of her talking to Margaret, of her standing at her window, of her watching the Browns' house. A single slip of paper was tucked between the photographs. 4 words were written on it: "Mind your own business." Claire's hands shook as she stared at the note, her chest tightening with a mix of fear and anger. Someone had been following her, documenting her every move. Someone knew exactly what she had been doing, and they wanted her to stop. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was it David Brown? Someone working for him? Or was it someone else entirely? Another player in the web of secrets she was trying to untangle. She sank into a chair, clutching the photographs in her lap. For the first time, she felt the full weight of her actions pressing down on her. She had been so focused on uncovering the truth that she hadn't considered the consequences. But now, they were staring her in the face. For a moment, she thought about stopping, about abandoning her investigation and pretending she didn't know anything. But then, she thought about Jenna's terrified face, about the look in her eyes when she had confessed her fears. Claire couldn't back down now. Whoever was trying to scare her clearly had something to hide, and that only strengthened her resolve. She gathered the photographs and the note, tucking them back into the envelope. She would keep them as evidence, a reminder of the risk she was taking, but she wasn't going to stop. If anything, this warning had only made her more determined to uncover the truth. Whoever had sent the package had underestimated her. Claire Madison wasn't one to back down from a fight, especially when it came to protecting her neighborhood. As night fell, Claire sat by her window once again, watching the Browns' house. The lights were on, and shadows moved behind the curtains. She wondered if they knew what she had received, if they were behind the threat, or if they too were being watched by someone even more dangerous. The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered and relentless. Somewhere in the darkness, Claire knew the pieces were coming together, and she was determined to find them all, no matter what it cost her. The following morning, Claire awoke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. Still groggy, she reached for it and squinted at the screen. Multiple text messages from Margaret lit up her phone, each more urgent than the last. "Claire, turn on the news. It's about Daniel Reed. It's big. Call me after." Adrenaline jolted her awake. She scrambled out of bed, threw on her robe, and rushed to the living room. Grabbing the remote, she flicked on the TV and tuned into the local news channel. The headline at the bottom of the screen sent a chill down her spine. "Police discover new evidence in Reed murder. Suspect list grows." The anchor, a composed woman with a sharp voice, detailed the latest developments. Investigators have confirmed that financial documents recovered from Daniel Reed's home suggest a connection to multiple individuals, including well-known real estate developer David Brown. While police are not naming official suspects at this time, sources indicate the investigation has expanded to include several high-profile figures in the community. Claire sank into the couch, her mind reeling. This was it. Confirmation that David was tied to Daniel Reed's murky dealings. But why hadn't the police made an arrest? Was the evidence too circumstantial, or was something bigger at play? The camera cut to footage of officers carrying boxes of files out of Reed's sprawling mansion, and Claire couldn't help but wonder what else they had found. Before she could process further, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Margaret. "Did you see it?" Margaret asked as soon as Claire answered, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and fear. "I saw," Claire replied, gripping the phone tightly. "It's David. It has to be." "Maybe," Margaret said hesitantly. "But don't you think it's strange they're not saying anything outright? If they have so much evidence, why hasn't he been arrested?" Claire hadn't considered that. Margaret was right. If the evidence pointed directly to David, the police should have acted by now. What were they waiting for? Or worse, was someone stalling them? Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock at the door. Startled, Claire shot up from the couch, her heart racing. She whispered hurriedly into the phone, "Margaret, someone's at my door. I'll call you back." She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A man in a gray suit stood on her porch, his expression unreadable. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and knocked again, more insistently this time. "Mrs. Madison?" he called out, his voice calm and professional. "I'd like to speak with you. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm an investigator." Claire hesitated, every nerve in her body screaming at her to stay silent. But the man didn't look like a threat. His demeanor was far too measured, and his suit looked more suited for a courtroom than an interrogation room. Against her better judgment, she unlocked the door and opened it slightly, keeping the chain in place. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice firmer than she felt. "I'm working on the Reed case," Hayes replied. "Your name came up in connection to someone who recently provided information to the police. I believe you may have been contacted by Jenna Green." Claire's blood ran cold. She hadn't told anyone about Jenna's visit, not even Margaret. How did this man know? "Why are you asking about her?" Claire said, trying to keep her voice steady. Hayes glanced over his shoulder as if checking to see if they were being watched, then leaned closer to the door. "Because she's missing. She was last seen leaving her apartment yesterday afternoon, and her neighbors reported hearing raised voices before she disappeared." Claire's breath caught in her throat. Jenna was gone? The image of the terrified young woman sitting in her kitchen flashed through her mind. Had she gone to the police after their conversation? Had someone silenced her? "I don't know where she is," Claire said carefully. "She came to me once, but I haven't seen her since." Hayes nodded, his expression grim. "If she contacts you again, call me immediately. This case is more complicated than it appears, Mrs. Madison. People are getting hurt, and I think you're closer to it than you realize." Before Claire could respond, Hayes handed her a business card and walked away, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. She closed the door and locked it, her hands trembling. Jenna was missing. The police were closing in on David Brown, but now it seemed there were other players involved, ones who were willing to make people disappear to protect their secrets. Claire sat down, clutching the business card. Her paranoia was no longer just paranoia. The danger was real, and it was closing in. But instead of backing down, her resolve hardened. If Jenna's disappearance was connected to David Brown, Claire was going to find proof. And if someone thought they could scare her into silence, they were going to regret it. She glanced at the photograph she had received the day before, still sitting in the manila envelope on her table. One in particular caught her eye. The image of the black sedan parked across the street from the Browns' house. Claire had dismissed it as just another visitor at the time, but now, with everything that had happened, she wondered if the car had been there for a different reason. Determined, she grabbed her notebook and began jotting down everything she had learned so far. The Browns, Daniel Reed, Jenna, the photographs, the black car, Robert Hayes. Each piece felt like part of a larger puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. She didn't know who to trust, but she knew one thing for certain. She was in deeper than ever, and there was no turning back. Claire sat motionless at the kitchen table long after Robert Hayes had left. Jenna's disappearance weighed heavily on her, sending her mind spiraling with possibilities. Who had taken Jenna, and why? Was it David Brown, or someone else pulling strings from the shadows? Every thread she followed seemed to lead her deeper into a labyrinth of unanswered questions. Unable to sit still, Claire decided to review the photographs from the envelope again. She spread them out on the table, studying each one carefully. The image of the black sedan across from the Browns' house caught her attention once more. Something about it gnawed at her, a detail she couldn't quite put her finger on. She leaned in closer, scrutinizing the car's license plate. It was partially obscured, but the first three letters were clear. LXN. Claire grabbed her phone and opened the browser, searching for any information on plates beginning with LXN. After sifting through generic results, she found a lead. The prefix was registered to a private car leasing company in the city. Her fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to dig further. If this car was connected to the Browns, or worse, to Jenna's disappearance, it could be the key to uncovering the truth. Her search was interrupted by the sound of her phone ringing. The caller ID flashed an unknown number. Claire hesitated, her pulse quickening before answering. "Hello?" she said cautiously. There was a moment of silence, then a deep, measured voice spoke. "You're in over your head, Mrs. Madison." Claire froze. Her grip on the phone tightened as the voice continued, calm and chilling. "This is your last warning. Stay out of it, or you'll regret it." Before she could respond, the call disconnected. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The voice had been unfamiliar, but its intent was crystal clear. Someone was watching her, and they wanted her to stop digging. For a moment, fear threatened to overwhelm her. But then, anger surged to the surface. She had been threatened twice now, and it only made her more determined. Claire immediately dialed Margaret, who picked up on the second ring. "Margaret," she said, her voice urgent, "I just got a threatening call. They told me to stay out of it." "What?" Margaret exclaimed, her voice rising. "Claire, this is serious. You need to stop. Go to the police. Tell them everything." "I can't," Claire said, pacing the kitchen. "Not yet. The police are already circling the Browns, but they don't know what I know. Whoever is behind this is trying to scare me off. That means I'm close to something." "Close to what?" Margaret asked, exasperated. "Claire, you're playing with fire." "I don't know," Claire admitted, "but Jenna's gone, and someone is trying to cover their tracks. If I don't figure this out, who will?" Margaret sighed heavily. "Promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Claire said, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. After hanging up, Claire returned to her search, her resolve stronger than ever. She managed to trace the leasing company to an address downtown. It was a sleek, modern building, the kind of place that catered to wealthy clients who wanted their anonymity protected. She jotted down the address in her notebook. If she could connect the car to someone in the Browns' orbit, it might give her the leverage she needed. That evening, Claire decided to drive past the leasing company to see what she could find. The city streets were quiet, the neon glow of shop signs reflecting off the wet pavement. As she approached the building, she noticed a row of luxury vehicles parked out front. Her eyes scanned the plates, searching for anything that might match the partial one from the photo. Nothing. Just as she was about to drive away, a familiar car caught her attention. The black sedan. It was parked in the shadows near the building's entrance, and this time the license plate was fully visible, LXN 9423. Claire's breath hitched. She fumbled for her phone, snapping a quick photo of the car and its surroundings. Before she could drive off, the entrance to the building opened, and two men stepped out. One of them was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark trench coat. The other was shorter, with graying hair and sharp features. Claire recognized him immediately. It was David Brown. Her hands shook as she watched them climb into the black sedan. The car pulled out of the lot and headed in the opposite direction, its taillights disappearing into the night. Claire sat frozen in her seat, the weight of what she had just seen pressing down on her. David Brown wasn't just a suspect in Daniel Reed's murder. He was actively involved in something far more sinister. And now she had proof that connected him to the black sedan, the car that had been lurking near her house and Jenna's. As she drove home, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Every set of headlights in her rearview mirror made her heart race. By the time she reached her driveway, she was gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She parked and hurried inside, locking the door behind her. Claire knew she was in deeper than ever, but she couldn't stop now. David Brown was hiding something, and she was going to find out what. But as she sat at her kitchen table staring at the photo of the black sedan on her phone, she couldn't ignore the fear creeping into her thoughts. Someone was watching her every move, and if she wasn't careful, she might be the next one to disappear. Claire barely slept that night. Her dreams were a tangled mess of shadows and whispers, and every creak of her house jolted her awake. By morning, exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but her determination burned brighter. The image of David Brown stepping into the black sedan played over and over in her mind. It wasn't just a coincidence. He was involved, deeply, and she was certain she was getting closer to the truth. Over breakfast, she scrolled through her phone, staring at the photo she'd taken of the black sedan and its license plate. She wanted to share it with someone, but who could she trust? Margaret was loyal but nervous, and the police still hadn't proven they could put the pieces together. Then her eyes fell on the business card Robert Hayes had left her. He might be the only one who could do something with this information. With trembling fingers, she dialed the number. Hayes picked up after 2 rings, his tone brisk and professional. "Robert Hayes," he said. "This is Claire Madison," she replied, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I need to talk to you. I found something." There was a pause on the other end, and then Hayes spoke, his voice quieter now. "What kind of something?" "I have a photo," Claire said, glancing at the image on her phone. "It's the black sedan that's been circling the Browns' house. Last night I saw David Brown get into it. He was with another man, a tall guy in a trench coat. I think this car is connected to Jenna's disappearance." Another pause. Then Hayes said, "Can you meet me? Somewhere private?" Claire hesitated, her instincts warning her to be cautious. "Where?" "There's a diner on 8th Street, Hayes said. "Corner booth in the back. Can you be there in an hour?" She agreed, her heart pounding as she ended the call. The idea of meeting with Hayes was both terrifying and exhilarating. If he could use this information to bring the truth to light, it might all be worth it. Before leaving, Claire double-checked her locks and grabbed her notebook, tucking it into her bag alongside the photo. The streets were unusually quiet as she drove to the diner, her eyes darting to every car that passed. Paranoia clung to her like a second skin, but she forced herself to focus. She had come too far to turn back now. When she arrived at the diner, Hayes was already waiting. He sat in the corner booth, a cup of coffee in front of him, his eyes scanning the room. Claire slid into the seat across from him, her movements stiff with tension. "You've got my attention," Hayes said, leaning forward. "Show me what you've got." Claire pulled out her phone and handed it to him. He studied the photo carefully, his expression unreadable. "This is the car you've seen near the Browns' house?" "Multiple times," Claire said. "And last night I saw David Brown getting into it. He was with someone else, but I couldn't get a clear look at him." Hayes nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the image. "The plate matches a car registered to a shell company. It's been flagged before, but nothing ever stuck. If David's involved, it's bigger than just this neighborhood." Claire's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" Hayes leaned back, his voice low. "Daniel Reed wasn't just a developer. He was part of a larger operation. Money laundering, fraudulent deals, you name it. David Brown's name has come up in connection with some of those deals, but we haven't been able to pin anything on him. If he's tied to this car and Jenna's disappearance, it's a game changer." The weight of Hayes's words settled over Claire like a heavy blanket. She had suspected David was hiding something, but this went far beyond anything she'd imagined. "So, what happens now?" she asked. "I'll look into this," Hayes said, sliding her phone back across the table. "But you need to be careful. If they know you've been watching them, they won't hesitate to come after you. Stay out of their way. Claire's jaw tightened. "I can't just sit back and do nothing. Jenna came to me for help. She's missing because she tried to do the right thing." Hayes sighed, his eyes narrowing. "If you keep digging, you'll end up like her, or worse." Claire said nothing, her resolve hardening. She wasn't about to let fear stop her. Not now. As she left the diner, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her eyes scanned the parking lot, her hand gripping her car keys tightly. The black sedan wasn't there, but that didn't mean she was safe. She climbed into her car and locked the doors, her heart racing as she drove home. When she pulled into her driveway, something caught her eye, a small envelope tucked under her windshield wiper. Her hands shook as she stepped out and grabbed it, her eyes darting around for any sign of movement. The envelope was plain, with no markings. Inside was a single piece of paper with a chilling message. "You've been warned." Claire's breath hitched and she quickly went inside, locking the door behind her. She stared at the note, her mind racing. They knew she had met with Hayes. They were watching her every move, but instead of deterring her, the threat only fueled her determination. She wasn't going to stop until she exposed the truth, even if it cost her everything. Claire locked the door and leaned against it, the crumpled note still in her hand. Her thoughts spiraled into chaos. The message wasn't just a threat, it was proof that whoever was behind this was close. Too close. She set the note on the kitchen table, next to the envelope of photographs, and stared at them both, her mind racing. Her phone buzzed on the counter, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Margaret. "Are you okay? Call me if you need anything." Claire hesitated before replying. "I'm fine. Just laying low." She left it at that, not wanting to drag Margaret further into this. The stakes were higher than ever now, and Claire knew she was on her own. Determined to push forward, she turned her attention back to the black sedan. If David Brown was tied to the car, then whoever owned it might have left a paper trail. She opened her laptop and began digging. It wasn't long before she found a lead. The shell company Hayes had mentioned was registered to a firm called LXN Holdings, which listed its office address as a high-rise in the financial district. A quick search revealed that LXN Holdings was linked to a series of scandals involving offshore accounts and illicit real estate deals. The deeper Claire dug, the more connections she uncovered. David Brown's name appeared in a handful of obscure records, buried among other high-profile figures. Her pulse quickened as she pieced it together. This wasn't just about Daniel Reed's murder or Jenna's disappearance. It was a vast web of corruption, and David Brown wasn't just a player. He was a linchpin. Claire printed out everything she found, adding the documents to her growing collection of evidence. She knew this was dangerous, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. If she had any chance of exposing the truth, she needed more, something irrefutable. The black sedan and LXN Holdings were threads, but she needed a needle to tie it all together. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft thud outside. Her heart jumped, and she froze, listening intently. Another sound followed, a faint scraping, like metal against glass. Slowly, she crept to the window and peeked out. At first, she saw nothing, but then movement near her car caught her eye. A figure dressed in black crouched by her vehicle, fiddling with something on the hood. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed her phone and quietly snapped a photo, her hands shaking as she did. The figure seemed to sense something and turned toward the house. Claire ducked down, her heart pounding. When she dared to look again, the figure was gone. She waited a few minutes before stepping outside, her senses on high alert. Her car looked undisturbed at first glance, but as she moved closer, she noticed a small metallic object attached to the underside of the front bumper. It was a GPS tracker. Her blood ran cold. They weren't just watching her, they were following her. Claire quickly removed the device, her hands trembling as she inspected it. The tracker was small and nondescript, but its presence spoke volumes. She carried it inside and placed it next to the note on the table. This was no longer a matter of suspicion. It was a game of survival. Determined to take control, Claire grabbed her bag and packed everything she'd gathered so far. The photographs, the documents on LXN Holdings, and the tracker. She wasn't sure where she was going yet, but she knew she couldn't stay in her house. It was no longer safe. Before leaving, she sent a quick text to Hayes. Found a GPS tracker on my car. Need to meet again. Urgent. She hit send and waited for a response, pacing the room. A reply came moments later. Meet me at the parking garage on Main and 5th. Top level. Don't let anyone follow you. Claire grabbed her keys and slipped out the back door, scanning the street for any sign of movement. The neighborhood was quiet, but the silence felt oppressive. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every parked car felt like a threat. As she drove, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror constantly, checking for headlights that stayed too long. When she reached the parking garage, she followed Hayes's instructions and parked on the top level. The space was dimly lit, and her car was the only one there. She waited, her nerves fraying with every passing second. Finally, a set of headlights appeared, and Hayes's car pulled up beside her. He stepped out, his face set in a grim expression. "You weren't kidding about urgent," he said, eyeing the tracker she handed him. "This is serious." "They've been following me," Claire said, her voice shaking. "They left this on my car, and they're watching my house. I don't feel safe." Hayes studied the tracker, his expression darkening. "This isn't just about intimidation anymore. They're trying to keep tabs on you because they know you're close to something." Claire handed him the documents she'd found on LXN Holdings. "This is what I've got so far. David Brown's name is all over it. The black sedan, the shell company, it's all connected. But I need more. I need proof." Hayes nodded, flipping through the papers. "You've done good work, but this is dangerous, Claire. If they know you have this, they won't stop at threats." "What do I do?" Claire asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Hayes looked at her, his expression somber. "You let me handle it. I'll take this to the right people, but you need to lay low. Stay somewhere safe and don't contact anyone, not until this is over." Claire hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. She had come so far, but now she was being told to step back. Could she trust Hayes to finish what she had started? Did she even have a choice? Reluctantly, she nodded. "Okay, but promise me you'll find Jenna." Hayes's jaw tightened. "I'll do everything I can." As he drove away with the evidence, Claire stood alone in the empty parking lot, her heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. For the first time, she wondered if she had pushed too far, and if it would cost her more than she was willing to lose. The drive back to her neighborhood felt endless. Claire couldn't stop replaying Hayes's warning in her mind. Lay low, don't contact anyone. The advice felt logical, but every fiber of her being screamed against it. She had come too far, uncovered too much. Letting someone else take the reins felt like surrendering, and Claire wasn't ready to give up. As she pulled into her driveway, her phone buzzed again. It was Margaret. "Claire," Margaret said breathlessly when Claire answered. "I just got off the phone with Jenny from 2 streets over. She says the police were back at the Browns' house this evening." Claire's grip on the phone tightened. What were they doing? "Apparently, they had more questions for David," Margaret replied, but Jenny said he didn't seem fazed. In fact, she swears she saw him laughing with one of the officers when they left. Claire's stomach churned. How could David remain so composed under pressure? Unless, of course, he believed he was untouchable. "Thanks for letting me know," Claire said, cutting the call short. Her mind raced as she paced the living room. There was something more to this, something she hadn't uncovered yet. She pulled out her notebook, flipping through the pages of notes and connections. The missing piece was there. She just had to find it. Her thoughts drifted to Jenna. If Jenna had been silenced, what had she known that made her a threat? Claire's mind returned to the photographs she had found on her doorstep. She spread them out again, scanning them for clues she might have missed. One caught her attention, a blurry shot of a figure near Daniel Reed's park. The timestamp showed it had been taken the night he was killed. Claire studied the photo closely, her heart racing as a chilling realization struck her. The figure in the photo wasn't David Brown. It was the tall man in the trench coat, the same man Claire had seen with David the night before. Whoever this man was, he had been at the scene of the crime. She snapped a picture of the photo with her phone and sent it to Hayes with a message. This man was near Reed's body the night he died. "Do you know who he is?" A reply came almost immediately. "Where did you get this?" Claire hesitated before replying. "It was left on my doorstep." "Do you recognize him?" This time Hayes didn't respond. Claire's unease grew. Whoever this man was, he held the key to understanding everything. The next morning, Claire awoke to the sound of her phone ringing. It was Hayes. "Claire, I've identified the man in the photo," Hayes said, his tone tense. "His name is Richard Langston. He's a fixer, someone who cleans up messes for people with money and power. He's been linked to several high-profile cases, but nothing ever sticks." Claire's heart sank. A fixer. That explained why Langston had been with David. "Does this mean he's the one who killed Daniel Reed?" "It's possible," Hayes replied, "but Langston doesn't act without orders. If he was there, someone sent him. And, given what we know, it's safe to assume David Brown is involved." Claire felt a surge of anger. David wasn't just a suspect. He was orchestrating everything. And Langston was his enforcer, the one tying up loose ends like Jenna and anyone else who got too close. "I need to find him," Claire said, her voice resolute. "If I can expose Langston, I can connect him to David." "Absolutely not," Hayes said firmly. "Langston is dangerous. If you go after him, you're putting yourself in his crosshairs." "I'm already there," Claire shot back. "They've been following me, threatening me. I'm not sitting around while they get away with this." Hayes sighed heavily. "Then let me handle it. I'm coordinating with people who can take them down. But you need to stay safe. Lay low like I told you." Claire ended the call without agreeing. She appreciated Hayes's efforts, but she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. If Langston was as dangerous as Hayes said, waiting might only give him a chance to disappear. She spent the rest of the day combing through everything she had gathered so far, trying to piece together Langston's connection to the larger picture. As evening fell, she decided to drive past the Browns' house, hoping to catch a glimpse of anything unusual. When she arrived, the street was quiet. The Browns' house was dark, with no sign of activity. Claire parked a few houses down and watched, her instincts on high alert. After about an hour, her patience was rewarded. A sleek black car, not the sedan, but a different one, pulled into the Browns' driveway. A man stepped out, tall and wearing a trench coat. Langston. Claire's heart raced as she grabbed her phone, snapping photos as Langston walked to the door. He knocked once, then entered without waiting. The door closed behind him, and Claire sat frozen, her hands trembling. Langston and David were meeting tonight. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't good. She debated her next move, her mind racing. She couldn't confront them directly. It was too dangerous. But she couldn't just sit there either. Her gut told her this was her chance to uncover the truth, to catch them in the act. As she watched the house, a figure appeared in the shadows near the side yard. Claire squinted, trying to make out who it was. Her breath caught when she recognized him. Robert Hayes. He was crouched low, moving toward the house with deliberate caution. He was here, investigating, just like he said he would. Claire's phone buzzed with a text from Hayes. "Stay put. Don't do anything. I've got this." But Claire wasn't sure if she could follow that advice. Not with everything she had uncovered. Not with the truth so tantalizingly close. And so, she waited, her pulse pounding as the pieces of the web tightened around her and the Browns' house became the epicenter of it all. Claire's hands gripped the steering wheel as she watched the house, her breath shallow and her nerves fraying. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. The sight of Robert Hayes sneaking toward the Browns' house had both reassured and terrified her. He was taking action, but the danger was palpable. Claire couldn't help but feel that everything was coming to a head. Inside the house, the faint glow of lights illuminated the curtains. Shadows moved back and forth, and Claire imagined David Brown and Richard Langston deep in conversation. What were they planning? Was Langston there to clean up another mess, or create a new one? Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a text from Hayes. "They're talking. I need more time. Stay put." Claire typed a quick reply. "What are they saying?" There was no response. Anxiety clawed at her as she glanced back toward the house. Hayes was taking a risk, and so was she, parked out in the open. She felt exposed, as if every passing car might contain someone watching her, waiting to strike. Her mind raced with possibilities. What if Langston and David spotted Hayes? What if something went wrong? And then something did. The front door of the Browns' house swung open, and Langston stepped out. His trench coat billowed slightly in the night breeze as he looked around, his movements deliberate and precise. Claire ducked low in her seat, her heart hammering. Langston seemed to scan the area before stepping off the porch and heading toward the side of the house, the same direction Hayes had gone. Panic surged through Claire. She couldn't see Hayes anymore, but Langston was moving with purpose. Did he know someone was there? Claire's mind raced. If Langston caught Hayes, he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate him. And if Hayes was gone, Claire would have no one left to trust. Her hands shook as she picked up her phone and dialed Hayes. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. "What?" Hayes whispered, his voice sharp. "Langston's coming your way," Claire said, her voice barely audible. "He's looking for you." There was a pause, then Hayes muttered, "Damn it, stay where you are." The call ended abruptly, leaving Claire in a suffocating silence. She clenched her fist, torn between fear and helplessness. Every instinct told her to drive away, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the Browns. But she couldn't. Not when the answers she had been chasing were so close. Suddenly, a muffled shout broke through the night, coming from the direction of the side yard. Claire's blood turned to ice. She strained to see what was happening, but the shadows obscured everything. She thought she heard scuffling, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. For a moment, there was silence. Then Langston reappeared, stepping back into view with unnerving calm. He adjusted his trench coat, glanced briefly toward the street, and walked to his car. Claire held her breath, praying he wouldn't notice her. Langston climbed into the sleek black car, and moments later it roared to life and sped away. Claire exhaled shakily, but her relief was short-lived. Hayes hadn't reappeared. She debated what to do, her thoughts racing. She couldn't just sit there. If Hayes was hurt or worse. Summoning every ounce of courage, Claire opened her car door and stepped out. The night air was cold against her skin as she crept toward the side of the house, her footsteps silent on the pavement. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure it would give her away. As she rounded the corner, she stopped abruptly. Hayes was lying on the ground, motionless. Panic surged through her as she rushed to his side. "Hayes," she whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. He groaned softly, his eyes fluttering open. "Claire, you shouldn't be here," he muttered, his voice weak. "You're hurt," she said, helping him sit up. "What happened?" "Langston," Hayes said, wincing. "He caught me, warned me to back off. But I heard enough." "What did you hear?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Hayes grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly firm. "David Brown isn't just involved. He orchestrated the whole thing. The murder, the cover-up, Jenna's disappearance. Langston was sent to tie up loose ends. They're moving fast because they know the police are closing in." Claire's stomach churned. "What about Daniel Reed? Why did they kill him?" Hayes hesitated, his eyes dark with something Claire couldn't quite place. "Reed threatened to expose them. He had the proof of their operation. Money laundering, fraud, everything. David couldn't risk it, so he had Langston take care of him." Claire felt like the ground was falling out from under her. Everything she had feared was true. David Brown wasn't just hiding secrets. He was a killer, willing to do whatever it took to protect his empire. "We need to get out of here," Hayes said, struggling to his feet with Claire's help. "If Langston knows you're involved, you're in danger." Claire nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just chasing the truth anymore. She was fighting to survive. And as she helped Hayes to her car, she knew this was far from over. Claire sped away from the Browns' house with Hayes slumped in the passenger seat, groaning softly as he clutched his ribs. Her knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as she tried to process everything Hayes had revealed. David Brown wasn't just complicit. He was the mastermind, and Langston was his enforcer. Jenna, Daniel Reed, and likely others, David's web of crimes was vast, and now Claire was caught in the middle of it. "Where do we go?" she asked, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. The streets were quiet, but she couldn't shake the feeling they were being followed. "My contact," Hayes muttered. "Safe house on Pine Street. We'll regroup there." Claire nodded, her heart pounding. Every shadow seemed alive, every passing car a threat. She gritted her teeth and focused on getting them to safety. 15 tense minutes later, they pulled into the driveway of a nondescript house. Hayes groaned as she helped him inside, locking the door behind them. Inside, Hayes collapsed onto a worn sofa, pulling out his phone. "Claire," he said, his voice strained, "listen to me. You were right about Jenna. Before Langston attacked me, I overheard him say she had the proof Reed was killed for. She hid it somewhere." Claire's breath caught. "Where?" I don't know, Hayes admitted, his voice tight with frustration. But it's the missing piece. If we can find it, we can take down David and Langston for good. Claire's mind raced. Jenna had come to her because she felt unsafe. If she had hidden something, it had to be nearby. Her thoughts jumped to the photographs left on her doorstep. Was there a clue she'd missed? She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the pictures she had taken of the evidence. One image stood out. A shot of Jenna standing near an old bench in the park, her face tense and wary. Claire frowned, remembering the park where Daniel Reed's body had been found. What if Jenna had hidden the proof there? We have to go back to the park, Claire said, her voice firm. Hayes shook his head weakly. It's too risky. Langston might still be watching. I don't care, Claire shot back. This is our chance to end this. Hayes hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Be careful. If you find anything, bring it straight to me. Claire didn't wait. She grabbed her coat and slipped out the door, her heart racing. She knew the danger, but she couldn't let fear stop her. The truth was waiting, and she was going to find it. Claire parked a block away from the park, her senses on high alert. The night was quiet, but every rustle of leaves or distant footsteps sent a chill down her spine. She clutched her flashlight tightly, her thoughts focused on the image of Jenna near the old bench. If Jenna had hidden something, it had to be there. She crept into the park, her footsteps soft on the damp grass. The bench came into view, shadowed under the canopy of an oak tree. Claire scanned the area, her heart pounding. No sign of Langston or anyone else. She hurried to the bench and crouched, running her hands along the underside. Her fingers brushed something, a small metal box taped securely to the wood. Her breath caught as she tugged it free and opened it. Inside were a flash drive and a folded piece of paper. The paper was a note from Jenna. If you're reading this, I didn't make it. This drive has everything: emails, bank transfers, proof of what David Brown and Langston have done. Take it to the police. Claire's hands shook as she slipped the flash drive into her pocket. She turned to leave but froze at the sound of footsteps behind her. She spun around, her flashlight illuminating the menacing figure of Langston, his trench coat billowing in the breeze. Well, well, Langston said, his voice cold. I knew you'd come. Claire's pulse raced as she backed away, clutching the box like a shield. It's over, Langston. I have the proof. Langston smirked, pulling a gun from inside his coat. I'm afraid it's over for you, Mrs. Madison. A sudden shout broke through the tension. Drop it! Robert Hayes emerged from the shadows, his own gun drawn. He looked battered but determined. Langston hesitated for a split second, his eyes darting between Claire and Hayes. Then, with a snarl, he raised his weapon. A single gunshot echoed through the park, and Langston staggered back, clutching his side before collapsing to the ground. Claire stared in shock as Hayes lowered his gun, his breathing ragged. Are you okay? He asked, stepping closer. Claire nodded, her hands still trembling. I have it, she said, pulling out the flash drive. This is everything. Hayes took the drive, his expression grim. This will end it. David Brown won't be able to hide anymore. The evidence on the flash drive proved damning. Emails, wire transfers, and detailed records linked David Brown and Langston to Daniel Reed's murder, Jenna's disappearance, and a web of financial crimes. David was arrested within days, his empire crumbling as the truth came to light. Langston, wounded but alive, was taken into custody and faced a mountain of charges. Jenna's fate was tragically confirmed when investigators found her body in a remote location tied to Langston. Claire grieved for the young woman who had risked everything to expose the truth, but found solace in knowing Jenna's bravery had brought justice. As the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, Claire found herself both relieved and changed. She had faced her deepest fears, uncovered the truth, and ensured justice was served. But she also knew the scars of what had happened would remain with her forever. One evening, as she sat on her porch, Hayes stopped by to thank her. "You did more than anyone else was willing to do," he said. "You didn't just uncover the truth. You gave people like Jenna a voice." Claire nodded, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She had learned that the pursuit of justice often came with a cost, but it was a price she was willing to pay. As Hayes drove away, Claire looked out at the quiet street. The neighborhood was no longer the perfect place she once thought it was, but for the first time it felt real, and she knew she had helped to make it that way.